Good morning. My name is Cameron Byrne, General Manager of Partnerships here at the AFA. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce today's webinar titled, Is Your Business Cyber Healthy? Practical Tips to Safeguard Your Business, partnered today with Centrepoint Alliance. Today, you'll hear from Ian Yip, CEO of Verto, Nicole Alexander, Head of Licensee Standards, Centrepoint Alliance, Peter Dematidis, Managing Director, Caboodle Financial Services. Ian has 2 decades of cybersecurity experience in a variety of leadership, advisory, strategy, sales, marketing, product management, and technical roles across Asia Pacific and Europe in some of the world's leading companies, including McAfee, Ernst & Young, and IBM. Peter is a new form of geek hybrid. Maths and finance nerdiness combined with a passion for communicating that has her on a mission to empower the public to take charge of their finances. Peter ensures her clients have the tools and information they need to make key financial decisions, along with the confidence to handle any hiccups that may occur. Nicole joined Centrepoint's compliance team in 2010 with a background in financial services and as a financial advisor. She's managed Centrepoint's audit team before commencing her current role as Head of Licensee Standards, supporting licensees and advisors to meet their compliance obligations and navigate the changing regulatory landscape. Cyber resilience is something that all business owners and their teams need to actively contribute to and understand the role they play within the business. It is not as complicated as you think, and there are simple tips that I hope you'll learn today that you can implement straight away. Today, our panel will deliver a better understanding of the landscape, plus work through some practical examples and tips to protect your business. Before we begin, I'd just like to cover off some webinar housekeeping issues. So today's webinar has 1 hour of CPD available, and we'll send out details of this within the next week. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will be available online at the AFA website shortly. Once this has been put on our website, you'll receive a confirmation email. We will answer your questions at the end of the presentation, but if I can please ask you to use the Zoom Q&A feature, not the chat feature. As you can see in the diagram on the slide, we'll cover those off at the end of the session. I'd now like to hand over to Ian.
Thanks, Cameron. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'll just spend the beginning of this covering off some numbers and set the context a little bit. I do have a very technical background originally, but I've since evolved, I suppose, into other aspects of cybersecurity, cyber risk, business in general. I run a Verto, so I don't just need to worry about cyber, I have to worry about finance. I am our own CFO, COO, legal counsel, all those other things. So I think the important thing to understand is cybersecurity isn't a technical pursuit in the sense that most of us think it is, or at least it isn't purely a technical pursuit. And I thought I'd just share some of the numbers behind why cybercrime is so profitable and so lucrative and attractive for a lot of criminals. And then we'll talk about some practical things that we have to think about and some tips. Now, it is very expensive for the world, cybercrime, 6 trillion this year, projected to climb to 10.5 trillion. So as a country, it will be the 3rd largest economy behind the US and China. And then by 2025, it will be exponentially larger than the damage caused by a lot of the really, really, really impactful things that we've seen that are as a result of nature. So it's not a small issue that we're dealing with, which interesting for me, coming from about 20 years of cybersecurity experience. Even 5 to 6 years ago, it was coming to the fore as a real business issue, but it never has been the case like it is today in terms of really, really being impactful to cyber. And I think the most important thing to remember is cybersecurity isn't a technical challenge. It's actually a business issue, and it's really about managing risk. That's all it is. You're just managing risk. There is no such thing as zero risk in general, whether it's financial risk, natural disasters and global impactful nature, things of that nature can throw at you. Cybersecurity is just a technical manifestation of one of those global risks that you have to deal with. And I mean, cyber criminals make a lot of money, right? I asked myself once, how much do they really make? And this is from a study by Dr. Mark McGuire a couple of years ago. So they're probably making more than this today. This is about a year or two old. But really, as a cyber criminal, it's really easy to make anywhere between $42,000 either US dollars to about $2 million. So you can see the attractiveness of why people want to be cyber criminals. The second part, which I don't think I have a slide for, is that the geopolitics really plays into what goes on. And if you think about some of the countries we tend to point fingers at, your Russias of the world, your Chinas of the world, and so on. The reason it's so lucrative is that some of these countries, I wouldn't go as far as using the word safe harbors, but the laws aren't in place to prosecute criminals the way they would prosecute traditional criminals like theft and crime and your homicides and all these kinds of things. In fact, the rate of capture for cyber criminals is more like 0.05%, which is ridiculously low compared to some of the capture rates for other traditional forms of crime. So you think about the risk posture of a cyber criminal, and it's a very low risk pursuit for them to make potentially a lot of money. And that is why cybercrime is so hard to stop. And actually, anyone can be a cyber criminal. You don't actually need to be technical. Some of these terms may be a little technical. I'll just quickly go through them. SMS spoofing is pretending to be somebody else's phone number. It's not that hard to do. Spyware is just what people put on machines to look at what you're doing. Hacker for hire, that's self-explanatory. Exploit kit for malware. So it's just ways to dump malware or viruses on your machine. And then the reason the 0 days are so expensive, 0 days are basically things that we haven't figured out solutions for. And the reason the iOS exploit is so expensive is because Apple's ecosystem is arguably the most secure one, because they curate all the information that you put on the Apple Store. So to find a 0-day exploit for an iOS device is really, really, really difficult, which is why if somebody comes up with it, they can sell it for $250,000. Point being, you don't actually need to be technical. You can just hire cybercrime type activities from somebody else for as little as $20 a month. And your data, by the way, is worth a lot of money on the dark web, right? These are from a couple of, from Experian and from a VPN company. By far, your medical records are the most expensive thing. But anything that is tied to your identity, that identifies you. Think about the 100-point checks you have at the bank. Those are generally the things that are most expensive. Someone asked me the other week, why is your health record so important? Like they literally said to me, this is a lawyer, by the way. They said to me, I don't care if I lose my health records. And I said, well, you should, because now the reason health records are so expensive is because when they're targeted, like on a politician or a CEO of a large corporate, it really does make a huge impact at the bottom line. Share prices can go tumbling if a CEO of a large multinational doesn't want the world to know that they're sick, but it suddenly makes their share price very unstable if the leader of the company is found to have a terminal disease. So it is absolutely impactful for business if health records get out. I think there was a targeted attack on Singapore not so long ago where they were targeting the Prime Minister of Singapore. Thankfully, he's okay, but his records got out. So they very often target world leaders. But the average person isn't immune from these things, because as an average person, while your data might not be worth what a prime minister's or a CEO of a global multinational is worth, they can use your information to pretend to be you and open fake bank accounts and do all sorts of criminal related things as you, and then you've just got to go unfurl all the mess they've made of your life. So no one is immune. And that is why there is a cost tied to even things like your social security number is a US version of kind of like a tax file number, right? Even though it's $1, it's still money. Now, I mean, let me quickly talk about us as we are a cybersecurity company, but we are a small business. So a lot of you are running small businesses and we have to manage cyber risk. We don't have the budgets to put every single piece of technology under the sun. So all I'm doing at any point in time is managing the risk versus any tech that we put in or where our data is sitting. The first thing to know is that cybersecurity starts at the top. I am the CEO, but I am also the chief security officer. Even if you have a chief security officer, the CEO should also be the chief security officer. There was a hack of I think a Finnish mental health company the other week, who's since gone out of business. And it's actually a story on Wired. If someone's interested, just email me. I'll send you the link. But they do very good investigative journalism on cyber a lot of the time. And the quote that stuck with me with that article was the CEO said that he wasn't responsible because the network and security teams are the ones who knew the ins and outs of their firewalls and technology and all that kind of stuff. Fact of the matter is, CEOs, managing directors, board members are always accountable, because you know what? If you're not accountable, you go out of business, right? There's been many, many cases. So I'm always very, very wary of that as a business owner and as the managing director, CEO of a company. So I make sure I model the behavior. It comes top down always. We overcorrect for making sure our people are properly trained and aware. And we can talk about some of these other things in more detail later. But it starts with that. It starts with making sure people don't do certain things. And it starts with putting in tech where it's going to be most impactful. And in places where you don't put in tech, you've got to manage for the risk that there's no tech to protect you by molding and coaching people towards the right behaviors so that you reduce the risk of something bad happening when you've got no tech in place. That's very basically how we manage it. At any point in time, we're always managing our key risks, things like defacement of our website, things like the unavailability of the solution that we provide, and so on. So you need to know what your top 5 risks are and manage to that effectively. So a couple of tips before I pass to Nicole. At the very least, these are foundational things you should be thinking about. Just patch. Like I have a habit. Every time something is available to be patched, I will patch it as quickly as possible. And I say the same thing to our team. I already said this, risk and cyber culture starts at the top. Take responsibility. Education and awareness is always going to be key no matter how much tech you put in. No amount of tech is going to be able to protect you from somebody accidentally clicking on something and downloading malware to your machine, because they're actually allowed to install stuff in your machine. Figure out where your important data is, and then you know what your crown jewels, in security we'll call them your crown jewels, what you need to protect. And I have a general rule, do not ever click on links in emails. Now, there are caveats around that, which we can discuss, but as a general rule, don't click on an email link if you can, and make sure everybody understands that they shouldn't be clicking on it. For the more advanced amongst you, extend your data to assets. There are intangible assets, tangible assets, technology assets. Make the point to actually really identify your risks at a business level, and then figure out what the gaps are. Like, how do you get from A to B? E-learning modules. I've talked about education, but e-learning modules are good and bad. They're good because it's better than nothing, but there's also ways to teach people that aren't about passing exams, because from the data that I've seen, if you just have people pass exams, then they focus on the exercise of passing an exam and not absorbing what they're trying to be taught, right? So just be aware that just e-learning modules alone aren't really going to fix your culture or going to do a heck of a lot for awareness and education in the long term. There's actually a lot of stuff that the government industry groups can help you with that are free. I'll have some links after this, and I think Nicole's going to talk a little bit about that. So trying to figure out how much you can do for free, right? Don't always have to pay for it. And then have a plan, roles, responsibilities to figure out what you're going to do when you get done in a cyber incident, no matter how big or small. And here are some links that you can go to. The Australian Cybersecurity Centre has a lot of good stuff. As a small business, actually, if you have an incident, you actually should be reporting it to the ACSC, and they will try their best for free to help you out. At the very least, they will catalog your incidents. There is a free assessment tool that the government's come up with, which I think they worked on with a couple of cybersecurity consulting firms, but you can just do a self-assessment for free and then figure out what your gaps may be. Honestly, it is, some of the recommendations probably aren't fit for purpose for the very smallest businesses in the world, but it'll still give you a few tips and tricks and gaps that you may not be aware of. And then a lot of people ask me about frameworks and where they start in terms of what are the key foundational controls I need to put in place. The ASD, so the Australian Signals Directorate, has a thing called the Essential 8, which are foundational controls that the government tells all the government departments to have in place, and it's a good starting point for small businesses. The general tip is you don't need to put all 8 in, but at least be aware of what they are so you know what the government and the ASD considers the foundational things you should be doing. So here are some contact details for our company, but you can also email me as well, ian@overtro.com, if you want to talk to me. But I will hand over to Nicole now.
Thanks, Ian. So my role today is really to talk about some of that governance. And as Ian said, really, it's about risk management. And maybe as a small business or an advisor, you think, oh, I don't really do risk management, but you do. Every day you do risk management. It might not be as formal as, say, those of you who maybe are self-licensed, or the sort of risk management that, you know, your larger licensees or advisors might do. But if we can move on, when I'm thinking about governance, and it really follows a very similar process to any sort of risk management process, really. So not going to spend a lot of time, so we'll be going through pretty quickly, but there's generally three broad parts to your governance framework that we're going to look at. Firstly, understanding your risks and responsibilities, and I think Ian has covered off some of that really well about your responsibility, because you might not be technical, but you can't abdicate that responsibility in the same way you wouldn't to any other part of your business. You want to know how everything works in your business, at least at a reasonable level. The second part is the things you can do to improve your cybersecurity. And as we also said, there's no way to completely protect against risk. So if something happens, how best to respond to it. And that's your typical sort of framework. So if we move on to the next slide. So I'm going to go through a couple of things here. So I think advisors, small business owners and licensees alike are now becoming more aware of cybersecurity. It's becoming more to the forefront, and I think perhaps we're still feeling very uncertain about how we manage this or how we address this. So a good place to start is to work out what the risks are to your business and what your responsibilities are, really to propel you, I guess, forward into taking action. So on the next slide, we talk about some of the, I guess, governance responsibilities, and I've broken it into sort of two areas. So both licensees and advisors are both bound by the Privacy Act, and also what we call notifiable data breach obligations, which is the Office of the Information Commissioner, which you have to report to if you have data breaches. And that's no matter what sort of business you are in our industry, because we have obligations under the Privacy Act we have to report. As we said before, we do hold a lot of information about our clients, from financial information to that really sensitive information about health, and that's really attractive to cyber criminals. Clients really expect us, and we have responsibilities to make sure we protect that data. As I said, that the finance sector in general is very attractive to cyber criminals. Financial theft and identity theft is obviously pretty serious. And if there's a data breach, we need to assess those breaches and report them. Licensees, for those of you who are small businesses or also self-licensed, you do have general obligations under the law to have adequate technological resources and risk management systems, which are key things to consider here. Data breaches or the loss or theft of data, including client information or your business information, is a risk that you need to consider. Of course, all business owners, as we said, do need to manage risks, not just licensees. And for those of us who are licensees, the obligation to have these adequate technological resources isn't just for our business. It extends to any authorised representatives businesses that work with you to make sure that their cybersecurity is up to scratch as well. Moving on, thank you. So all businesses face risks from conducting business digitally or online, but typically your small business don't have those sort of expert IT staff that you might have in a larger business to manage that risk. And you as the business owner will probably find that you're also the IT manager in your business, or you're relying on someone else to ensure that you're protected. And unless you have the right knowledge, you could be operating under a false sense of security or also with a high level of risk in your business. So it's important to understand the consequences of a cyber attack or an accidental breach on your business. Of course, in addition to the impact on your clients and the loss of their information or the privacy breaches, there's a huge disruption to your business potentially here. Lost time, lost data, financial costs to deal with the issue and recover from it. So that some of those things, you really need to understand. And research suggests that small businesses are the focus of cyber criminals. It's not just big businesses. So you do need to know where you might be vulnerable, as well as what and how to improve your security. And Ian mentioned that cyber vulnerability assessment that you can do online, which he's already mentioned, that I've said there, that can help you identify areas that you might need to improve. Okay, next slide. Love a good statistic, which I found really interesting. This is the Australian Cyber Security Centre, which is part of the Signals Directorate, that they did a survey of small businesses particularly so that they could understand what the cyber practices or cybersecurity practices of small businesses were, so they could then provide tools and guidance to help those businesses protect themselves from cyber incidents. And I've put down some of the findings here for you, picking out a few key ones. 20% of the people who responded to the survey didn't know what phishing was. And that's particularly concerning, I think, because malicious emails are the most common type of cybersecurity incident. So it's really important that people know what that is. Other findings showed generally a fairly low level of knowledge and poor cybersecurity practices across small businesses. And the survey also identified a number of barriers. So they felt there was challenges for people to understand and implement the security measures. It felt quite complex for them. They saw that small businesses underestimated the risks and consequences of cyber incidents. And in fact, people who had had a cyber incident were far more concerned about it happening again and the consequences. So they understood that risk and consequences much more. And there was a lot of gaps in how people plan for and respond to an incident when it occurs. So it's an interesting read. Okay, next slide. I think once you appreciate what the risks are and your responsibilities are, and you understand what your business's strengths and weaknesses are, what should you do next? You need to have a look at your cybersecurity arrangements, and how you can implement things to improve your cybersecurity, making sure you've got the right expertise and support, and making sure everybody knows the rules in your business. People are critical in making sure you're protected. Next slide. So I think I mentioned before, you need to treat cybersecurity as you would any other aspect of your business, and make sure you've got in place a framework or rules about how you operate. There's some really great guides available, a lot of government resources, but the Small Business Best Practice Guide and the Small Business Cybersecurity Guide, which I've mentioned here, can be useful to help you improve your knowledge and determine what those sort of measures you should have in place. And a lot of them mention that essential 8 that Ian spoke about as well. Once you decide what measures you're going to do, and you do have to assess what things you can practically put in place, what things you can afford to put in place, what your risk level is, but document down what it is you're going to have in place. Have your policies and procedures written down, what, how, when, who is responsible for certain things. It might be things like policies about how your staff should use devices, emails, internet, etc., to best protect you. And if you're outsourcing, if you've got an IT expert or a managed service provider, I think you need to make sure you know what those service providers are doing for you. Make sure that they've implemented those, I guess, essential measures that you think are necessary for you. Unfortunately, you might find some service providers aren't providing what you need or want because you don't ask for it, or you don't have that sort of information to have that proper dialogue with them. So educating yourself can be really important. If you're also self-licensed, make sure you add cybersecurity risks to your risk register. And as I mentioned before, look at the businesses or the advisors that are authorised by you and make sure their cybersecurity is being addressed as well. Next. Training and awareness, I think, of anything is probably a really critical thing for you to do. Everyone in the business needs to know that cybersecurity is a priority and how they can contribute to you being cyber secure. Again, repeating what Ian said, cybersecurity isn't an IT issue, or it isn't just an IT issue, and you can't manage or mitigate threats just by putting in place technology alone. Everyone's actions is really important to make sure you contribute to your better cybersecurity. Some things you can do is just make it more visible, make it as important as any other aspect of how you do business. Talk about your cybersecurity regularly, bring it up in meetings. Once you've documented those policies and procedures, for example, share them with your staff. Education is really important so that everyone knows their role. Everyone understands some of the common threats, like what phishing is and how to identify them and stop them from happening. And it's not just a once-off thing. You can't just do education and set and forget. It does need to be regular and ongoing, much like you do with your CPD now. Lastly, we've got the next slide is responding to an incident. As we said, that small business survey identified there was a gap in how businesses plan for and respond to incidents. You can't 100% prevent an incident. So if one occurs, how do you prepare for that? How do you minimise the damage? How do you respond and recover? And then finally, what obligations do you have if there is an incident? Does it have to be reported, and who to? So moving along, those sort of steps for cyber resilience. So plan ahead of time, how you're going to respond to an incident. Trying to figure out what to do when it happens is not the best time to be doing it. An incident response plan, of course, can be really scaled according to the size and complexity of your business. It could be as simple as who's going to do what if something occurs? What simple things or steps can you take? Like if you've accidentally clicked on a link in a malicious email, do you disconnect the device from the internet to stop that from, proceeding whilst you deal with it? If you have a breach, you might need to recover lost or compromised files or damaged systems. So part of your planning ahead is having your data backups as well as testing to make sure that they're not corrupted when you need them. One of the tips could be to talk about cyber insurance with your broker to determine if it's right for you. And if you think it is, make sure you know what is and isn't covered. When you're thinking about that, you do have to think about the risk, the threat, how much risk you're prepared to take, the benefit of that, and the cost of it, of course, if you're potentially looking at it. Keep reviewing and updating your governance, repeat your security vulnerability assessments periodically, review your policies and procedures, all those sorts of things. Make sure you review and make sure that the outsourced providers or the IT service providers that you use are adequate. And if you're a licensee, those are the sort of reviews you need to be documenting so you can demonstrate compliance with your general license obligations. And finally, from me on the last slide, if you do have an incident that is also a data breach, because you can have a cybersecurity incident and not have a data breach, but quite often they go hand in hand, you do need to then assess if this is a notifiable data breach, which needs to be reported to the OAIC. And you can see from this slide, this is some data from the OIC specifically about the finance industry. Human error accounts for 28% of data breaches, but many of those sort of malicious or criminal attacks also rely on people to be successful in actually gaining access to the systems. You're sort of the gatekeeper there. So you need to have a plan for data breaches. And if something happens, talk to your licensee. They should have a data breach response plan as well. So that's some of the governance things. I think we're going to hand over now to Peter. Thanks.
Lovely. So I think Cameron was keen for people to start asking some questions. What I've done is actually reached out to my network in the industry and got the questions that perhaps they're not willing to ask in public. And so I'm going to sort of be your proxy here. So I'd go so far as to say, if you're a little nervous about asking a question and wouldn't put it in the Q&A, feel free to message me directly in the chat if that's how you'd feel better. I'm happy to take that hit. I'm representing all of you here. So I've got a list that I'm going to start asking questions, but please pop them in the Q&A as we go, and we'll cover those as well. So my first one, and I'm going to sort of dive into the practicality of this because I think that's where it gets hard, right? So my first takeaway from what Ian and Nicole just covered is I think we should probably all go away and do that security vulnerability assessment immediately. That's probably the first thing we should do, is just go and do that assessment, because you want to know what trouble you're in. Let's not be like our clients that just put their head in the sand about this issue like people do about their money, right? And they just ignore it till it gets bad. Okay, so get an assessment. But I think let's talk about some practical reality here. So Ian, you mentioned make sure your upgrades and your patches are up to date on your operating systems. I've got to say that I'm always wary of the latest, so we run Macs, but of the latest operating system stuff, because every time it feels like you update as soon as they tell you to, invariably it shuts something down or it causes a problem. And so therefore you have to wind that back. Ian, is your view that the security updates in any sort of operating system update are worth a bit of pain of it maybe causing some issues with a few apps and things like that? Is that your take on those updates?
The short answer is yes, because I think pretty much every time they put one of those updates in is because they're going to include security fixes. So very often people find security gaps, sometimes major, sometimes not so major. So I will generally over-optimize for that. The flip side is you are managing other risk, right? You're managing business continuity risk, because if you've got an app sitting on your machine and the new patch breaks it, then you've got a continuity problem. So I would say, look, it's balancing that risk up, right? Can you afford to get done for a security breach because Apple's released a patch that you didn't patch? Or would you rather just risk the security bit because you might not be able to run the app that you had? What I will say is if your app isn't getting updated alongside Apple's patches and so on, you may want to change your provider, because the onus should be on the provider of the application is using to maintain their currency with the latest operating system for the good of security as well. So that's kind of the equation you're managing. But I will always update my operating system version, and then I'll deal with the fallout afterwards.
Please excuse me coughing and sputtering. Thank you. Nicole, you mentioned cyber insurance. Do you have any sense of what that costs? Does anybody have a feel for, are we talking 100 a month, 1,000 a month, 10,000 a month? Like, is there a feel for what that type of, or either of you actually, what that type of add-on to your cover would cost for a small business owner?
Look, I'd probably say it's going to be different depending on the business. What I do know is that you probably need to talk to your broker to find out about it. They will ask questions about things like your data security, your data governance, things like your revenue or your turnover or those sorts of things will impact on what your premiums are, because they're working out, what their risk is, I guess. So cost depends on turnover, the sort of data you hold, the sort of protections you have in place, and those sort of things. That cybersecurity survey said that approximately half of the businesses that they surveyed spent less than $500 a year on cyber security. So cost is really critical. So you do need to weigh up, is this where it's best spending your money, and those types of things as well.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And look, we all understand the balance of premium versus value, right? So, but my sense is it's not in the tens of thousands of dollars of cost. And so then it's about the impact of the event, which is going to be much bigger than that, because that's going to be a continuity and all sorts of risks. So, and asking the question, it's one of those things, it's so easy to ask that question, your broker will be able to tell you, they'll be able to give you those quantums. So we've actually got a question pop up. Thank you, Matthew, for your question, because I've got one similar. So let's start with mine, and we'll lead straight into his. In things like LastPass, are they the be all end all they're pitched as? Are they a furphy? Are they a must have? Where would you put things like that are password management tools in terms of the importance of having them? I
use one. So I use Bitwarden because it's free, and actually you don't need to pay for one. I mean, Bitwarden's not the most usable thing in the world, but I can offset the lack of cost with having to have the usability not be as good as LastPass and some of these other things. I didn't use them for the longest of times, and then the more we have this proliferation of passwords around the place and I have to remember all of them and changing them all the time, because being a security person, I want to make sure I cycle through them. But at the same time, even for me, it's quite overwhelming to deal with all these other things. So my short answer is you should use one, and just use a reputable one. So LastPass is pretty good. If you don't want to pay money, get Bitwarden.
And I think what I've noticed with us having used LastPass for a while is it also gives you the freedom to use those hieroglyphic passwords, because normally if you don't do that, your tendency is to use something that involves a word, or like it's something that presumably is much easier to solve or hack. Whereas the ones that they, can then be suggested are those, multiple dashes and numbers, and so therefore much harder for somebody to hack. So I noticed that just in terms of behavior. And of course, in advice for most of us, we have hundreds and hundreds of passwords for every product provider. Like, it is nuts. So the concept of us being able to manage that without writing them down somewhere, also a risk, then, I figure that's probably necessary. So Ian, what was the name of that password management tool you mentioned?
Bitwarden.
Bitwarden, as in prison warden, good
Yes.
bit. Okay, perfect. Well, then layering on then Matthew's question. So he's asking about your opinion of virus or internet security software like McAfee, Norton, YBER, those sort of things. What would your take be on those?
You must have one on your machines. Like, it's just really nowhere around it. That said, you don't necessarily pay for one. So generally, the well-known names are pretty good. So I'm ex-McAfee. I know for a fact McAfee normally rates fairly high on the effectiveness scale, but McAfee costs money. So your McAfees, your Nortons, your Sophoses, your Kaspersky's, and so on, they're all pretty good, right? But you got to pay a license fee. If you can offset, again, it's managing risk. They're more likely to catch viruses. But if your behavior isn't that risky, use a free one. I actually use Avast on my Mac, and the free version of it, because I have evaluated my own risk posture for cybersecurity, and my behavior is generally fairly responsible. So I know I'm not going to do silly things, which means I don't necessarily need McAfee or Norton antivirus, but I still have antivirus on my machines.
That's really useful, I think, because, and for all of us, I think when you're managing a team, your ability to, and particularly when they're as inexperienced as ours will be with this sort of issue, your ability to potentially manage that risk initially might be less. So it could even be something perhaps that you start with something a bit more intense, the paid version, and over time when you feel like your team are getting more trained, are getting more, on top of this stuff, you might change later on down the track, perhaps. It might be a way to manage that risk. So what else have I got here? Oh, I've got to be cheeky here. So we talked about emails and links, and you invariably clicked on a link to be part of this webinar. So that's what we'll, so in reality, when we're talking to our staff about this, what is the way you approach that with your staff? Because it clearly isn't every link is bad. So what's the way, what's the filter, what's the sort of insight you give them to help them understand that risk and therefore the way they manage it?
Yeah, so yes, my comment around don't click the link is it's just an easy soundbite. What you really should be doing is making sure the link you're about to go to is a link you recognize.
Right.
So I will not click on a link unless I know where it's going to take me, is probably the more realistic answer. Now, the way you do that is you hover your mouse. If you're on a laptop or a desktop, you hover your mouse over the link and go, where's this link taking me? If you don't know what the link is, do not go to it. The other way to do it is, as a general habit, just copy and paste where you can a link and paste it directly into your browser. Because a lot of times, just because you see a link look like something you trust doesn't mean the underlying link is going to take you to what you're seeing on the screen. The encoding behind it can be hidden. There's a slightly harder conversation or problem when it's on a mobile device, because you can't hover anything on a mobile device, but you actually can. If you press your finger on a link and don't move it, which is not easiest, then the link should come up and you can see the link. So the short answer is always make sure the link you're going to get taken to is something you trust. And if you don't know what it is, don't go there.
Yeah, okay. And I think just asking the question is a start, right? So merely getting people to hesitate and question it is a perfect start, because like you say, I mean, we do it even in newsletters. You don't type a link anymore, you embed it over a word, right? You sort of have it sitting there and it's just a blue word that somebody clicks on. Who the hell knows what that's going to? So, it's a really valid point to make. Now we've got a couple more questions, Wes, thank you for that. So Wes is just asking, is there a best antivirus for Mac versus PC? Like, are they quite different these days, or have the providers sort of got quite consistent across both?
They're pretty good around both. So that, I mean, there are differences in how you write them. But if it's good for Mac, it's generally going to be pretty good for PC, because the signature is going to be at a high level fairly similar. I did see a question around WebRoot and all that kind of stuff. Some companies do benchmarking and testing of all these antivirus products every year. So if you can Google them and just look for the rankings for CNETs and the well-trusted sources, you'll generally get a ranking of the effectiveness. Like, this one's 99% effective on the PC, this one's 95% effective on the Mac, and you can have that weigh against the price and make a decision as to whether you want to pay half price for something that's 95% effective versus something that's double the price for 99%. Similarly, managing risk is sort of the broken record phrase I'm going to keep saying.
Awesome. And so for those of you that aren't aware, CNET, literally CNET, it's like a website and a isn't it a magazine sort of concept for IT people? So if you want to be freaked out and not understand much at all about what's there, you could dive in. However, I've used a lot of their stuff just to compare apps because they do wonderful and really clear analysis of things like that. So that's a great start, will be to, McAfee versus Norton on something like that, and you'll just get a side-by-side analysis, which is really powerful. Lee's just asking here about which insurance broker specialists for financial planning industries offer cyber insurance. I'm guessing that your general insurer is a place to start. So whoever your broker for general insurance is, would they be the first place that we should start to ask about cyber insurance? If either of you got a view on that?
I think we would generally talk to the same sort of ones who do things like your PI insurance and those types of things. I'm not sure necessarily whether all GI brokers, but I expect that'd be a place to start. Ian, do you have comment?
I've spoken to a few of the cyber insurers. Generally, it's like buying any other insurance. It doesn't solve your cyber problem. It just reduces your financial risk. That's really all it's doing. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying just treat it literally like insurance rather than actually putting controls in place to mitigate any sort of actual impactful risk. You're just mitigating financial risk.
Yeah, it's a little bit like if you've got PI insurance, it doesn't mean you're going out there willy-nilly doing anything you want when you're giving advice because you've got insurance. Of course, you wouldn't do that. So it's the same with the cyber insurance, I think. Doesn't replace good practices and technology.
It's a great topic because it sort of brings us to Daryl's question here. He's sort of saying, paid antivirus software, is that always, keeping that up to date, is that adequate security to rely on for cybersecurity, threats? And I guess my response, and I get your take on here, both Ian and Nicole, is my response is it's like saying if I have income protection and I ride a motorbike, I'm not going to have an accident. Like you can like human mistakes are still real. It can still happen. And just because I've got the protection doesn't mean, or even the software doesn't mean that a human can't completely short circuit that entire process. And I think with all of us maybe working from home more as well, maybe even being virtual completely, having the software won't be enough. There's still some behaviors that it sounds like are really important to sort of change the team and the way they approach these things and the risks that they're willing to take on your behalf as they do different things with the systems and the tools we use.
And if you have good governance in place, it can reduce the cost of your cyber insurance and that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, exactly. Just like PI, right? It's the same sort of thing. So there was a live situation last year. I'm really curious, Ian, with your take on this. So Zoom, where everybody was using Zooming. We were all Zooming, and in the middle of the COVID thing outbreak, and then Zoom had this issue, this security issue, which my understanding was people could pop into a Zoom without being invited. There was this sort of random issue. What I'd like to have you, and in our industry, what was interesting about that is all of the big product providers, so we're talking the platforms and the insurers, all just stopped using Zoom. They all freaked out. And I get it, it's uncertainty, but what's your take on the actual risk that was sitting there? Because I think it might be an interesting lesson for us all to then be able to assess these risks. Is what's the real challenge you're facing? What risk could it pose? And therefore, what do you do about it? So can you talk us through what actually happened there?
Yeah, so there were two main issues to the whole Zoom thing, right? Number one, Zoom actually had some security flaws in their software.
Okay.
And they subsequently had to go hire a head of security, a very well-known guy, to basically deal with the PR fallout. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes a PR fallout for people to actually spend money on security. We all know that. So there was a real security issue. However, the real risk for most of us is actually fairly low. You're more likely to get somebody to Zoom bomb you than have a malicious virus introduced through Zoom's code.
Okay.
For the record, we don't use, Avetra doesn't use Zoom. We did the risk assessment and we thought we wouldn't use it. A lot of federal government departments and state government departments actually also banned Zoom because of that reason.
Yep.
Because they felt the risk was too high. I think the main thing to keep in mind is that the media also they like headlines, and it gives them headlines, right? So you read a lot of the stuff around state-sponsored attacks and all these sophisticated attacks, and the percentage of actually what happens in the headlines is single digits at best. Like 1 to 2% of the cases are like that. 95% of the time, it's really basic things that aren't sophisticated at all. So I think put that lens on in managing risk, and then think about, okay, what are the assets I'm trying to protect, and what risks am I exposing myself to, and then make that decision. And if you're still happy to use Zoom because of convenience, go for it. Just understand you might get Zoom bombed randomly, and you'll just have to all be aware. Again, awareness education. Zoom bomb, just stop talking and then stop it, right? You can get around it, even though somebody infiltrated your meeting.
And so I think that was probably the first, is understanding what actually happens. Like if the thing is going wrong and people are talking about it, what is actually occurring, so that then you can work out where you apply your energy. And I'm with you. If the risk is somebody could drop in, okay, well, the team will need to know that's possible, and how to tell. Okay, what is that? So it's then a training exercise, because that's what's hard is for us as small business owners assessing these things, because I mean, it was every headline everywhere, wasn't it? So it's really hard to just go, that's not a problem. I guess then it's just us assessing the risk for our clients' data. It's things like that probably is the key thing to be aware of. So then another situation, then let's layer that. So there's tools like Otter. So otter.ai is a transcription tool that can sit sort of embedded in Zoom or Google Meet or any of those video meetings and live transcribe the conversation you're having. So clearly that is then transcription, that is capturing a conversation, say, with a client. How would you suggest we approach assessing that sort of tool, and what the risks are inherent in that from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, I actually did this with a few, so we don't transcribe our meetings. Because I'm generally not happy with the answer I get when I go find out about these companies and how they secure my data, right? So Otter and some others, I'll do two things. First thing I'll go to the website and figure out whether they have any statements about security at all. Because if they've got no statements of security or privacy, they don't care. If they do have statements, then I'll read them to see what they say. If they look very boilerplate, I'm kind of iffy. If they look like they've really thought about it, that's a nice little tick in the box. And the third thing I'll do is I'll go to LinkedIn, the company's webpage, and I'll try and figure out if they've got anyone in that company that actually is responsible for security. And if they don't, that's a big red flag for me. So these are really simple things. You don't need to be a technical person to do. And then if they're big enough companies, Google around as well. Sometimes people enlist all their stuff on LinkedIn. See what they've been saying. See if they get involved in some of the press when they're talking about risks in general. Like even beyond security, understand if they know how to manage risk. If that company doesn't know how to manage risk, they sure as hell aren't going to know how to manage security.
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat those because I think they were really powerful but easy. We can all do these things. So, check out the website. Do they even talk about security? Like, does it privacy, any of those things, does it even come up? When it does it look like it's the same one that 47 other businesses have used and it's just too general? There's no, personal elements to it. And third, try to find out through LinkedIn or other places, do they have somebody that's responsible for security in the business? I mean, I love that as like a systematic way to assess a tool because, we don't have those skills to do that. And I'm not sure that the dealer groups do either. They really struggle with that as well with tools we use. So I think, that sort of systematic approach is a great way to start to then get a sense of, whether there's something we should be concerned about, whether it's, like you say, cybersecurity or just quality. It's just whether, is this a quality provider? Yeah. And so that's something we can all sort of use as a technique.
I think, Peter, there, as you said, rather than also trying to reinvent the wheel every time a new app or something comes up that you want to use, this is where your procedures can be documented down. These are the steps that we follow before we start using something to assess it. So when we're looking at the application, what data does it have access to? Is it used to store the data, transfer the data, all those sorts of things? What sort of important data is it? Like you mentioned before with Zoom, if it's just a chit-chat meeting, maybe that's not concerning, but if it's something like, records of meeting notes and it contains clients' personal sensitive information, that's more important to make sure it's secure. And as you said, so then do your research to make sure that those apps meet security standards, and like Ian suggested, going to the websites and doing those sorts of things, and then figure out what can you do to make them more secure. Like with Zoom, they've made upgrades, they're password protected now, and those types of things as well. Get an inventory of the ones you currently use and do this assessment even if you're using them now, and then do the same when you're looking at new apps and the like.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've got a really structured way we approach apps generally, just because I'm a bit app excited. So I'm more likely to introduce too many rather than less. So I've put that structure in place anyway, and we'll just automatically add those steps. Like this is just, if you're going to put forward an idea in the team of something we want to use, you will have to have checked these things. So if you're just filtering that constantly, and it's also then making the team more aware of those as well, which I think is really powerful. Chris has got a great question here. All these ideas, we've sort of looked at them as between our team and the world in a general sense, and those risks. What, suggestions do either of you have in terms of working then with clients? Because clearly there's a lot of information that can go backwards and forwards with clients, whether it's via portals or, as a conversation in Zoom. What are some ways that obviously protecting that to the extent that's appropriate? Because of course, then there's a line where things can become really difficult. So it's getting that balance of making it reasonable for a client to do, but also ensuring that their data is secure. What suggestions do either of you have?
I'll tell you what we do. So I've banned the sending of attachments with sensitive documents by email.
Yep.
Now, the way we share documents securely is, take your file sharing app of choice. We use Google. So we will tell our customer of ours, we will send you some info, but you'll get it via the sharing link. And then we will put it on Google Drive, and then we will deliberately share it only with the people we want to share it with. The reason that's good is because at any point in time, you can take that access away. Once you send an email, it's gone, right? And how often have we sent an attachment to the wrong email address? I think Woolies did it a few years ago, right? And we had all these Woolies gift card numbers sent out to everybody. So that's often the easiest mistake to make. It's just a simple policy, like we have a policy, and it's not even, we don't enforce this with tech, by the way. This is a literal policy we've written, and I've told the whole team this is how we share it. If there are some roadblocks in getting the data to them, then they have to ask security for approval, security being me. Right. So they have to ask me for approval before they can attach anything to an email to a client.
I like it. And I think, look, that's not such a bad, from our end, being really structured about the documents we have for a client, the client file, that actually ensures that. So if what you're doing is putting it in that place and then sharing the specific link to that item and only to them, then that's giving more rigor to that. I know with teams in multiple places, then sometimes things can end up on people's desktops like it's all a mess. So this will just reinforce that structure and say that's where it's coming from. So to that end, then Google Drive, Dropbox, there's all these sort of different file sharing tools. You're broadly comfortable with those? Is there anything we should be aware of or watch for with those tools?
So generally two things, right? Number one, do you trust the security? Similar to what we were talking about earlier.
Yep.
This, by the way, this that we're talking about is actually supply chain risk. You are managing supply chain risk. And if any of you work with APRA regulated entities, APRA has a regulation called CPS 234 that mandates, and one of the key things they say on there is if you're APRA regulated, you must implement a supply chain cyber risk process, meaning every single one of your suppliers, you need to understand what additional cyber risk they are introducing to your business. So what I will say is you should do the same due diligence on your suppliers. If you're using Dropbox, Google, Microsoft, do the due diligence. They might not give you a response to a questionnaire, but it's kind of what we're talking about. Go to the website, understand that they're doing security. Are they big enough to care? What do they say they do? And then secondarily, do they have the controls for you to be able to lock down certain bits of files that you're sharing to very specific people for access controls? And if you do those very basic things, you're doing better than most people.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And because something that's out there, and this is an honest to goodness question from me here, but I know it exists for others too, is there's a perception that a physical drive, like, your G drive or like whatever it is in the office, that's much safer than these tools. Like there's a perception that that's the case. Is that real? Or if something like that is connected to the internet, really you're exposed potentially there too? Is there a reality to having a physical location being better?
Only if it's not connected to the internet. So okay. Literally lock it down, put it in the room, no external connectivity, then yes.
Which is unlikely, right? Because that would mean
unlikely, that is the only case where it's safer. And then your physical security measures come into play because somebody can still break it.
Yeah.
And presumably then you've got other issues such as data backups and
using it at all. Yeah.
Well.
Yeah. Okay. Because I don't think that's something that people do hold on to, is potentially it's all right. We've got our, drive in the office. It's all fine. It's like, no, there are still, the minute you've got a little blue cable from those things to anywhere else, the exposure still exists. And so certainly it sounds like don't let the benefits of something like a G Drive or these other tools be held away from you because you're thinking that you're doing better by being having a local drive. It sounds like you still need to assess those risks just the same way. And so you could end up with a much more effective outcome and still, potentially have even improved your security due to behaviours with your team and things like that. So I know people mention the physical thing as something that's real. So thank you for that.
Probably the other thing worth mentioning there too is having a look at your business about where it is you store data, because I talk to a lot of advisors and they'll have data on their software like their Xplan or those sorts of things, but they also store it on a G drive, or there'll be some on their desktop or on a USB. Like, data is all over the place. Having it all in one secure place is probably a better option as well.
Well, and now here we go. So this is something that's a behavioural thing that I think we have probably all got into the habit of, and I'm betting, Ian, you and your team do not do this: free Wi-Fi. So I'm guessing nobody in your team uses free Wi-Fi anywhere they go in. Is that a valid approach?
If we can avoid free Wi-Fi, we will. So I will generally hook my laptop up to my mobile to get to the internet if I can, where possible.
Yep.
I get there are practicalities around. So if you're overseas, or of course we can't be overseas right now, but when we were allowed overseas, it's a little harder because you've got roaming charges around data. So I get there are costs around that. The way I manage that risk is if I ever do have to connect to a free Wi-Fi, I turn the VPN on. So another important tool is to have a VPN on your machine and your devices that you trust, so that if you ever do have no other choice but to do free Wi-Fi, you turn that VPN on. Yeah,
okay. Because I think it happens at conferences, so we all go into the conference, it's free Wi-Fi, yay. And when you think about that, that's shooting fish in a barrel for a cyber criminal. Like, they'll be like, wow, fantastic, there's 1,000 financial advisors in this room. I'm just going to sit outside and see what I can get access to. So the very time you're likely to use that, I think, puts you at risk. It's like when you're traveling and you've got your camera hanging around your neck, you're making yourself a target. So it sounds like, where possible, those things are free for a reason. And one of them is it's just not as protecting you as well as it could. And you're exposing yourself. So that's really helpful. Ian, I've got a question for you here, Ian. Lee wants to know whether you do audits on businesses in terms of their cybersecurity. What stuff do you guys do if somebody's interested?
And we're mostly tech. What I will say is I'm happy to have a chat. We don't really do professional services as such, but we do work with some firms. So depending on what everyone's needs are, that we could potentially at least point you in the right direction, or work with a consulting firm to use our tech to enable the way to do it in a much more cost-effective manner for a smaller company, for example.
And there are more and more of those out there. I know there are some businesses coming up for this will focus on financial advice businesses too. So there's more of that, because this is becoming more and more real for people. There's more and more people specializing in it. So, but thank you for that. I'm sure people will be reaching, you poor thing, they'll be reaching out in droves looking for help. Somebody was just asking, so I've typed in here Bitwarden. There was another thing you mentioned that was the antivirus that you've used. What was the name of that again?
I use, there's two that you can use, Avira or Avast.
Avira or Avast. There we go. I hope everybody's got that.
Free, the last time I checked.
Perfect. Now, I'm conscious of our time. Do we have time for another question, or Mel or Cameron, are we okay if I do another question?
No, that's fine. Make this the last question. Thanks, Peter.
Okay. All right. So let me dig through and see. I think we've covered all of those. So two-factor authentication is something that's coming up a fair bit. And I know probably everybody listening to this webinar is frustrated as all get out by wet signatures that are necessary for some things. What's your take on two-factor? Is it sensible for a small business to look into that sort of thing? Is it possible? What's your take?
I will always turn it on where possible. It doesn't always have to cost money either. I mean, Google has a pretty good app for a second factor. At the very least, use the SMS one, but actually the SMS one is not the best way to do two-factor, but still better than not having two-factor.
Yeah, okay.
It's better having the software token thingy on your phone. So Google Authenticator is got a lot of capabilities for two-factor authentication, and most modern sites who support two-factor will support something like a Google Authenticator as a second factor.
Fantastic. Well, and I think we can all now approach the product providers too and and push them for this, because particularly with COVID, people are more used to QR codes. They're more used to a whole lot of things. And so I think, we can start adding that value for our clients to make things more secure, but also easy, because two-factor isn't that big a deal. It's easy for people to do. Thank you. I'll pass over to Cameron.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think two-factor, it's something we do get used to as we get used to the new technology in the space we're all operating in. So it's something that you just don't think twice about. So Ian, Nicole and Peter, thanks for putting this important information together today to help our members.